It happened to me this time. Every now and then you see these stories about people buying old rescue guitars that turn out to be really valuable. And if you think this is one of those stories, well, you'll be a little disappointed because this is not life-changing money we're talking about here, but still a hell of a steal. A couple of weeks ago I came across this beautiful old Pearl guitar on my country's equivalent for Craigslist. I say beautiful, but she's decently scratched up and mighty dusty and was listed as defective. That can mean a lot of things, but for an unbelievable $40, however, it's worth a gamble in my book. See, Pearl, which you might know best for their drums, did make some electric guitars back in the 70s and 80s, and I believe this is one of them. Look, this thing was obviously well loved and played. Not to a point where it looks amazing again, but still pretty cool in my book. I chatted with the seller, a really nice bloke who said he got an offer for $120 online but didn't want to deal with shipping the thing. He had owned it for over 20 years and knew little about it except that it was already old by the time he got it. And he's right, because Pearl stopped making guitars in the early 80s, and even then they had already replaced the headstock shape with something less lawsuit-inducing for their exports. Looking at this headstock, this is obviously one of those Les Paul clones that make Gibson's lawyers rotate in the coffins they sleep in during the day. Everything I found online firmly points at their 71 to 73 lineup, especially the plate securing the screw-on neck. Unfortunately, the plate is losing its gold paint/plating, and the serial number that sometimes was there is long gone. If you look very closely though, the faintest "Made in Japan" can still be seen. Exciting. This thing is similar to this PE2162 in one of their old Japanese catalogs. Yep, looks like this is the one. Could be yours for just 36,000 yen or 222 euros if those were around back then. Adjusted for inflation, we're talking more like 700 euros. Neat. I liked how it felt right away, but when I peeked at the tuners, I swear I almost peed my pants a little in excitement. The keen-eyed amongst you might have already spotted that the pickups look quite different from what you saw in the catalog, and I was so giddy to take it home and find out more about it. And I was right. Apparently its previous owner in Germany used this thing as a mod platform in the 80s and threw a bunch of upgrades at it. Made in Germany tuners by Schaller. Made in Germany roller bridge by Schaller. Made in Germany tailpiece. Doesn't say, but I assume by Schaller. And the pickups still with what seems to be a 1986 date code on the back. Made in Germany by Schaller. I believe these to be the Schaller 212B 2-in-1 pickups, but more on those later. Even the freaking strap buttons are Schaller S-locks, with a part that goes on the bell too. Now to the more annoying part of the guitar. I already mentioned that it was sold as defective. The first thing I noticed was one of the fretboard inlays jumping off the board, but a little bit of super glue convinced it to stay in place. Luckily, it didn't mean a headstock break or any major cracks, but it did mean that one of the pickups didn't work at all, and the little switches also didn't really seem to do anything. Speaking of the switches, again, some might have spotted them earlier. I assume these were added during the 80s overhaul of the guitar. But what they were supposed to do, I'd yet to figure out. There's obviously dings, scratches, discolorations all over this thing. I mean, look at the back. There is something that looks a little bit like a crack around the neck pocket area, but I think it's just superficial. Even when I took off the neck, I couldn't really see any big damage in there. The only thing I found in there was some cardboard that one of the previous owners put in there, probably to shim the neck a little and get the action a bit lower. Let's throw the thing on the workbench and have a look. Oh, bullshit. Who designs electronic cavities like this? This little cavern makes it a pain to check what's wrong, and I had to take some of these components out to really get to them for closer inspection. After stabbing it with a multimeter for half an hour, it was pretty clear that one of the potentiometers was shot and there was something wrong with one of the little switches. The potentiometer simply didn't show sensible resistance readings on one end of its travel, and even a generous amount of contact cleaner didn't change anything about that. The switch literally fell apart the second I got it out, so yeah, that needs replacing. I tried to open it up a little bit to see what's going on, but turned out to be just a regular switch. I still hadn't made a sense of this web of wires that reminded me more of one of these old-timey phone switchboards than the inside of a guitar. So I painstakingly went through the whole thing to make this ugly drawing to turn into this slightly less ugly diagram. And with the help of looking at a bunch of stuff on the best website for this kind of stuff, guitarelectronics.com, I started to figure out what we were working with. See, two of these switches turn their respective pickups from serial wiring to parallel wiring for a different tone, while the one that gave up early on life phase reversed them for a tone only a mother can love. Speaking of questionable wiring choices, not only goes this guitar with a terrible 70s choice of using linear taper pots for volume and audio taper for tone. In case you don't know what that means, it means that the volume knob does not sound at all like it gets consistently louder or quieter to your ear, and the tone knob does nothing until it does everything in the last 10% of its travel. Not only did they wire it like that, they also reversed the bridge and neck pickup, so the controls are upside down from any other Les Paul I've ever played. Great. I don't even think it's an accident because the pickup selector switch is inverted too. No, I'm not gonna mess with that. I consider this bullshit to be vintage correct in this case, and I focus on fixing the actually broken bits. Couldn't get the pod back to life, so I replaced it with a new one from Goldo Music, of course 500k linear to preserve the setup from hell. The switches I had plenty lying around from pedal projects, and except for the color, this is now the same as both the others and not the curiously different Suicidal Loner. Then I plugged everything in and it still didn't freaking work, and after questioning my life choices for a bit, I found that some of the other wiring on one of the other switches was coming loose, so replacing those wires finally got it working. Shining it up a little, polishing the frets with a Dremel and oiling the fretboard, and this beauty looks as pretty as it looked after the maniac who owned it first dragged it over the floor of every live music pub in Western Europe. Still nicer than before though. I'm still considering staining the more egregious scars black so they don't stick out so much, and maybe give the neck plate a shiny new coat of golden spray paint. Before we get to a playing demo, here are a few stats. We're looking at a nut width of 41.75 millimeters or 1.65 inches, which widens to 51.45 millimeters or 2.02 inches by the 12th fret. The neck is about 22.15 millimeters slash 0.87 inches deep at the first fret and thickens up only a little bit to 24.8 or 0.98 inches by the 12th. With 3.9 kilograms slash a little over 8.5 pounds, it's not heavy, a little less than your average Les Paul, partially due to being only 41.6 millimeters or 1.64 inches thick around the edges. I'm not great at describing neck shapes, but it does feel thinner than my Epiphone SG, but not a super thin shredder neck. The scale length is the typical Gibson one at 24 3/4, but the fretboard radius is astonishingly round. Look, I only have these crappy radius thingies I 3D printed myself, but that thing is not only more curved than a Gibson, it's more curved than a damn Squier. 9-inch radius maybe even 8.5? It also doesn't seem to be quite even on both sides. 1970s workmanship, I guess. The pickups read 30k ohms in the neck position in Sirius, and 3.3k ohms in the neck parallel, 12.7k ohms for the bridge in Sirius, 3.2k ohms for the bridge parallel, and then as Struggly says just for fun, 6.4k ohms in the middle position, both in Sirius, and for even more fun, 1.64k ohms middle position, both parallel. And of course you can still mix the Sirius slash parallel in the middle position, but we need to leave something up for the imagination. By the way, there's no difference between the regular and out of phase setting, which, as will become obvious in a minute, tells you that these readings alone don't really give you a full picture of the tone. So I suppose you want to hear some of these tones, and I will do my best, even though I'm shit at guitar. Let's have a few samples for almost all of these crazy switch positions first. All in all, there is a little crackle on some of the pots, but I prefer this on an old guitar versus replacing all the vintage electronics. Yeah, so this is it. I think it's a hell of a score, especially for 40 bucks. What is it worth to the right buyer? Hard to say, as there aren't really that many on Reverb, but similar ones have been offered at 400 to 600 euros. The Schaller parts, even used, are probably worth 200 to 300 bucks alone, so even in the condition it is in, I think 500 is probably a fair price if I decide to let it go. For me personally, I really dislike the fretboard radius, but it will be difficult to part with this bridge pickup for sure. Let me know in the comments below what you think, and if you have any more information about these 70s Pearl guitars.